Now, in this experiment, this is the apparatus we use.
That looks diabolical.
That's just the way the baby monkey feels about it. Flashing eyes, loud sounds, moving mechanical parts, all of these things are designed to frighten a monkey. All of these things are designed to frighten a monkey.
Found a 50% increase in major depressive disorder between 2011 and 2014.
All of these things are designed to frighten a monkey.
Major depressive disorder with severe impairment is a similar pattern.
Scared, all right.
This one has been separated from his mother for 6 months.
Most concerning of all, the suicide rate of 12 to 14-year-olds has doubled.
All of these things are designed to frighten a monkey.
Greetings, friends. I'm Arnold Schroeder, and this is Fight Like an Animal, the podcast at the intersection of biology and politics. You can find the bibliography for this and all other episodes of the podcast at againsttheinternet.com. And today we are going to be doing part 3 of what I still believe, but I'm not entirely certain, is a 4-part series, Nature, Nurture, Death Spiral. Maybe it'll spread out into 5. And we're going to be, if in episode 1 we talked about sort of the establishment of the basic notions of cultural determinism in the development of early 20th century social sciences, today we are going to be talking about how, like in temporal terms, we're going to be talking about the story of social science between that kind of initial advent of the idea that there is no human nature in the early 20th century through to kind of like the 90s, through to kind of the end of the century. And then we're going to be talking about how the processes of reasoning that got invoked in various schools of thought that denied human nature, defending their position, how those forms of reasoning diffused out of academia and into social movements, and how even if you never found yourself particularly troubled by questions of whether or not there is human nature, you never were avidly engaged in anthropological debates, you never had a fervent opinion about the theories of Michel Foucault or whatever, how your experiences of trying to create social cohesion, create a sense of shared identity and common purpose and common interests, and getting people to do things, coming together and fighting for any kind of common cause, how that's really and truly very affected by these notions that otherwise live in obscurity and essentially largely forgotten debates in academia. And before I dive into the material that I've prepared, I just wanted to make this note really quickly, which is in the last episode, we talked about cross-cultural universals, and we talked a little bit about, I don't know if there's a more concise term for it, but like technologically contingent cross-cultural universals, or universals that are in any case contingent on some external condition being met. Like we talked about the elaboration of hierarchy that accompanies the development of agriculture everywhere that is encountered, how their societies become more complex. There's more clearly differentiated social roles, but there's also just like a more intense hierarchy, a class system with like a very conspicuous ruling class with a massive concentration of resources, and how that can also happen, like for instance with the Kwajalein storing dried salmon, so that there's not like the technological impetus there per se, but a condition is met, the capacity to accumulate tons of surplus, which usually comes about through agriculture. But in any case, we talked about those kinds of cross-cultural universals, the universal responses that human social groups exhibit to certain conditions. And I've been thinking about how this really is true in terms of the dynamics of power and of resistance, and how much, like the place since the last time I recorded that it really popped off was Belarus, right? But how much like what happened there looks like what happens in Hong Kong, looks like what happens in New York City, looks like what happens in Portland, Oregon, looks like Chile, looks like Ecuador, looks like Bolivia, looks like everywhere that there's a significant concentration of power. There's also people who are resisting it in remarkably specific ways. There's an incredible cross-cultural uniformity of the ways that people without massive concentrations of power choose to confront that power. And that's actually very noteworthy, considering how legitimately different other aspects of the environment and the history and the culture and the conditions are in all of these different places for all these different people. It's not as if Russia and Iran and France and the United States all took like very similar cultural paths or have like similar levels of resources laying around or anything else, but there is very clearly a common language that's being spoken. Anytime you look at any of those photographs of people throwing tear gas canisters back at riot police, defending themselves with umbrellas or whatever, you can see that there is this truly universal language, and it's evolving. Certainly, like in the 1960s, early 70s, there were tons of very concerted resistance movements to existing power structures. They also tended to emulate those power structures in many key respects. They had like explicit hierarchies, and they usually had like leaders and all that, right? And since that time, a paradigm has really spread around the world, and it actually is quite remarkable how rapidly it's spread and how many different places have adopted these same basic notions of decentralized, of like a kind of very different. There's a cross-cultural universality right now of power dynamics exhibiting one kind of like, it's not only that they have a greater capacity for violence, it's not only that there's a correlation there between the hierarchy that they manifest and their means of fighting for it being more, like having more rocket launchers and AR-15s and all that in service of that hierarchy versus other people fighting for a different worldview with like umbrellas and bicycle helmets. It's not just that, but it's also just like the actual social processes that underlie when you see protesters and riot police in a confrontation in the streets. You really are seeing a confrontation between two different ways of human social groups going about organizing themselves and making any kind of collective behavioral undertaking happen in the first place, because everywhere that's happening, from Hong Kong to Iran to Ukraine, wherever, there's a decentralized form of consensus-based decision-making really has become just the absolute default, and it goes by no particular name whatsoever. There certainly are anarchists who are like, this is kind of actually like anarchism is spreading everywhere. But if that's true, the beauty thing that I would say about it is that people are understanding that they don't need to call it anything. They not only don't need to call it anarchism, they just don't need to be like, here's the big philosophy, like, come all you who subscribe to the ideology. That's antithetical to the very spirit of what is happening in the streets, like we talked about last episode, And I think that this is actually really amazing on so many levels. I think that much really interesting theory on cross-cultural universals could really profit from incorporating something about how people choose to fight systems of power. So anyway, yeah, I guess the question that we're asking today is, how could you devise a mode of looking at the world, a way of talking to people and approaching conflict that would be maximally designed to diminish any sense of unity or shared purpose that we might get from making this observation that everywhere that there are systems of power, there are people who choose to fight those systems of power in the same ways. And to do that, I guess we could start with Harry Harlow.
He's scared, all right.
And he does what any child will do in a similar situation.
He runs away.
It's more than running away. He was running to his mother, to touch her, to drive away his fear. Contact with the mother changes his entire personality. Look, now he's actually threatening the diabolical...
So in the mid-20th century, Harry Harlow set out to challenge some of our most fundamental assumptions about behavior and usher in a new paradigm of knowledge. He did this by asking a bold question that other scientists had apparently lacked the lucidity, creativity, or courage to ask. Namely, if you separate a monkey from its mother at birth and subject it to a daily regime of torture, will the baby monkey go insane?
Now, suppose that in addition to an environment that is merely strange, we produce one that's really frightening.
And the answer, as it turns out, is emphatically yes, right? You can drive a monkey absolutely insane by separating it from its mother at birth and subjecting it to a daily regime of torture. Now, Harry Harlow's experiments were awful. They are sometimes credited with providing some of the initial impetus for the establishment of the animal liberation movement in North America. But they also, at the time, legitimately challenged a near consensus in the social sciences. And the reason for this was because of the insistence that there is no human nature and the unanticipated logical consequences of maintaining that position. So that's really the story that we're telling today. This is very much a story of unanticipated consequences. Harry Harlow was presenting science, as much as maybe he shouldn't have tortured baby monkeys to do it, he was presenting science that was in contradiction to the claims of the behaviorist school of behavior, which I think was like a really arrogant name for them to take on. That's like calling your political party politics or something like that. But whatever, they did that. So B.F. Skinner and J.B. Watson are the big names associated with behaviorism. And J.B. Watson is the founder, was very much coming from this motivation of like having pretty utopian aspirations for science. Watson's most famous quote is, "Give me a dozen healthy infants, well-formed, in my own specified world to bring them up in, and I'll guarantee to take any one at random and train him to become any type of specialist I might select. Doctor, lawyer, artist, merchant chief, and, yes, even beggar man and thief, regardless of his talents, penchants, tendencies, abilities, vocations, and race of his ancestors." And so, that's nice. That's a nice sentiment. I mean, it might seem a little bit ludicrous at the outset, right? The unwillingness to acknowledge literally any differences between people seems like something that, like, you don't need heritability studies to know that people just actually do have some pretty significant differences between them. Not everybody is born to study particle physics or to play violin solos or fight MMA or whatever, right? Like different people really just do have different capacities, and I don't know why that's so terrible. I mean, like the motivation in the case of Watson is an opposition to inequality, but I just don't understand. Like to me, this obsession with making everybody the same is really incomprehensible. But it's vaguely sympathetic. It's like it's not a desire to cause suffering and commit pure evil. It's not an explicit desire to make baby monkeys suffer, but that's what ends up happening. So behaviorism ended up there. 20th century social sciences had just like innumerable versions of the same debate. The nature versus nurture debate played out in infinite permutations in all of these different subdisciplines of the social sciences. And in behaviorism, the real weird detour that ended up being gone down was a denial of any kind of nature to pretty much any animal whatsoever. This was a logical extension of denying human nature, right? It's pretty easy to see how people who were doing that could get painted into that corner, because okay, so culture, so we have no nature, culture shapes our behavior entirely. Why doesn't culture, whatever that thing is, since we apparently don't create it, since it apparently falls out of the sky and just imposes its will on things, why doesn't it impose its will on a rock? Or certainly, why doesn't human culture impose its will on an otter or a bear or whatever? And so this necessity develops to claim that all species behaviors are just sort of like historically contingent adaptations to schedules of reinforcement, that all behavior that you see everywhere is learned in this very strict sense of having no initial template existing in the mind of the organism exhibiting the behavior for that behavior, that it was just a way to meet some physiological necessity, food, shelter, sex, whatever, that was learned at some point, and then that reinforcement created like a stable, predictable version of that behavior repeated over time. So, for instance, it was claimed that the mother-infant bond that is so conspicuously present in so many different species had no innate basis whatsoever, and that the reason that infants, I don't really know what the hypothesized reason for mothers being bonded to the infants were, but the hypothesized reason that infants bonded to their mothers was purely food, right? And it was further hypothesized that they could be conditioned to have the same attachment to whatever happened to be providing them food, even if it wasn't a member of their own species. And so this had many manifestations. For instance, B.F. Skinner somewhat famously created a device called an air conditioner, air, H-E-I-R, which was an artificial setting in which his infant son could be reared without human contact. So that's a bummer, but it was not just bad for human infants, it was also bad for monkey infants. And Harry Harlow was a scientist who decided to test some of these assumptions, which were quite popular, which were accepted by a very, very considerable majority of behavioral psychologists at this time in the mid-20th century, that these ideas were really kicking around. He decided to test this notion that the mother-infant bond was solely a learned behavior based on nutritional reinforcement. And he did this by rearing monkeys in isolation from their mothers, and by giving them different like model mothers that had different features. So, for instance, he created these like wire armatures that the monkeys could nurse from. And then he also created these cloth-like replica monkey mothers that gave the infants the ability to rub their skin on something and get some of the contact comfort that they would get from being in contact with their mother. And and so then he documented, for instance, the ostensibly shocking result was that the monkeys actually did want to cling to something that had any kind of vague semblance to a mother, as opposed to wanting to cling to a wire sculpture that had a bottle in it. But he also just really decisively disproved the theory by turning a bunch of monkeys into lifelong utter wrecks, right, of just psychologically destroying generations of monkeys. His phrasing, I'm paraphrasing a little bit, I haven't read the paper in a minute. He said something like, long-term isolation rearing renders the animals such that their primary social and emotional response is fear.
These fellows all lived with a wire and cloth mother for the first 6 months of their lives. This one has been separated from his mother for 6 months. We're going to put him into a home cage to see whether he still remembers and loves.
So there's that shocking result. It turns out that monkeys do in fact have a nature, and they can't simply be conditioned to respond equally well to any given environment as long as there's some way to interact with it and get food. And this is the kind of result that would shock nobody. This is one of the many cases that really illustrate the point that almost nobody is as capable of being as wrong about a given situation as somebody who specializes in studying it. How any layperson observing the same situation in case after case would actually come to a more reasonable conclusion about it. And so again, we can kind of see this parallel with Samoa. Like I described in the first episode of the series, Margaret Mead went to Samoa with fairly sympathetic motivations. I mean, the immediate motivations were to prove that human nature doesn't exist, and however sympathetic that is, like the ultimate motivations for that intellectual undertaking were to deny a scientific foundation for inequalities, in particular racial inequalities. And it wasn't motivated by a desire to be evil or anything like that, but very quickly in the process of trying to make the Samoans sound more different than us, than they actually were, in an effort to make culture sound like this, mysterious external force that imposes itself on different groups and makes them infinitely arbitrarily different from one another. She ended up depriving the Samoans of essential human qualities. And likewise, J.B. Watson and B.F. Skinner and all the rest, they started wanting to deny limitations on human potential, and they wanted to deny the inevitability of certain forms of inequality, and that's nice. But in the process, and then it's like a few unanticipated logical steps away from the initial position that they staked out in service of that ideological impetus, that there is no human nature. All of a sudden, you're taking a baby monkey away from its mother for 6 months, and then you're making like a mechanical insect robot that you're putting in a cage with the monkey to see whether it runs to a lifeless wire armature with a bottle to get comfort from the evil insectoid robot, and the monkey's psychologically shattered for life. Denying the essential nature of beings has fucking consequences. I mean, we could also extend this out to be all vast about it for a second. We can extend this out to all the socialist projects that came to distinct cultures and said all of these roles that you inhabit are invalid. This culture is invalid, and like come to the collective farm and live a whole new way. Like those things wouldn't have been evil to do if people had no nature. And Harry Harlow certainly wasn't the only like pretty decisive refutation of behaviorism. B.F. Skinner's graduate students, actually. So B.F. Skinner wrote a book called The Behavior of Organisms, and his graduate students in 1961 ended up writing a paper called The Misbehavior of Organisms, because they had spent at that point, and they were coming from this perspective initially of having been like sincere acolytes of the behaviorist paradigm. They really believed that otters, monkeys, bears, and eagles all truly had no distinct natures that made them otters, bears, monkeys, and eagles, that that they were all just exhibiting conditioned behavior, learned adaptations to get food and things like that. And, but they had at that point been working in the laboratory with different species for like a couple decades, and they had just collected too many raw observations that utterly contradicted that notion. So, so once again, the great scientific paradigms have to be shattered, and they end up writing something that overthrows decades of cherished scientific opinion, and it sounds an awful lot like common sense. But so what Breland and Breland say in The Misbehavior of Organisms is, the notion of instinct has now become one of our basic concepts in an effort to make sense of the welter of observations which confront us. When behaviorism tossed out instinct, it is our feeling that some of its power of prediction and control were lost with it. From the foregoing examples, because the paper is just replete with, all these examples where they tried to train some animal to do something, and the chicken was like, well, I'm going to scratch, and the raccoon was like, I'm going to wash this thing, where they just acted like the animals they were. So anyway, from the foregoing examples, it appears that, although it was easy to banish the instinctivists from the science during the behavioristic revolution, it was not possible to banish instinct so easily. And if it is advisable to reconsider those things that behaviorism explicitly threw out, perhaps it might likewise be advisable to examine what they tacitly brought in, the hidden assumptions which led most disastrously to these breakdowns in the theory. 3 of the most important of these tacit assumptions seem to us to be that the animal comes to the laboratory as a virtual tabula rasa, that species differences are insignificant, and that all responses are about equally conditionable to all stimuli. It is obvious, we feel, from the foregoing account, that these assumptions are no longer tenable. After 14 years of continuous conditioning and observation of thousands of animals, it is our reluctant conclusion that the behavior of any species cannot be adequately understood, predicted, or controlled without knowledge of its instinctive patterns, evolutionary history, and ecological niche. Okay. And something like this happened over and over and over again in all of these different subdisciplines of social sciences. In 1992, John Tooby and Lita Cosmides, 2 evolutionary psychologists down at some UC in Southern California, wrote a really important essay called The Psychological Foundations of Culture. And this essay kind of surveyed social sciences over the course of that century that was coming to an end as they wrote. And they ended up calling all varieties, the infinite varieties of doctrine that asserted that there is no human nature, the standard social sciences model, the SSSM, because it was by far the dominant position in academic departments, but there was such a bewildering variety of different approaches that all said this. And in fact, Tooby and Cosmides pointed something out that I thought was so insightful. I had never really seen anybody mention that before. But in the essay, they point out that the division of labor in the social sciences itself is really a kind of direct consequence of the denial of human nature. And what I mean by that is that, like in the rest of science, the divisions between the fields is just a matter of analytical convenience, but there's not an actual discontinuity, right? It's not like if you're studying the behavior of motor proteins in an organism, like you can break that far enough down and it's just chemistry, right? And there's nowhere you go within the entire realm of the rest of science where that isn't true, where you can't simply progress through a given subject in on its borders are all these other subjects, like you want to know about sine waves, that's trigonometry, but you want to know the rate at which a sine wave is changing at any given time, that's calculus. In all of the rest of science, any given science truly is like a facet of, a manifestation of, a foundation for, an extension of every other aspect of science. And this only becomes not true when you get into social sciences, and it's only like that because people insisted on the discontinuity. People insisted that they make social science this like magical realm where all other knowledge simply couldn't penetrate and no other mode of analysis could be allowed. And so when you think about the compartmentalization of the social sciences, it doesn't follow that same pattern really, where you're like, right, yeah, like anthropology describes this body of knowledge, but at its borders is this other discipline. They don't all like complement each other or clearly provide a foundation for one another or flow into one another in the same seamless way. Like why is there anthropology, sociology, psychology? You're right. These were actually just divisions that were more reflected rather than truly distinct forms of knowledge that integrated with all other knowledge. They were just sort of like approaches. They're more just like disciplines just came about like reflecting essentially stylistic differences. So there's something like deeply unnatural just about how social sciences are segregated, how they're taught in all these weird different ways that don't explicitly encompass like legitimately distinct forms of knowledge in any particularly clear way. But so anyway, Tooby and Cosmides say about all of the different nature versus nurture debates that took place during the 20th century, they're talking about, just to give some context for the language, they're talking about how these debates ultimately all are about ideology. Whatever arguments are invoked, they're ultimately all a reflection of the fact that a lot of people just have a baseline psychological need to deny the existence of human nature because they're afraid that human nature implies that their utopia is not a possibility, right? So they say, this morality play, seemingly bound forever to the wheel of intellectual life, has been through innumerable incarnations, playing itself out in different arenas and different times. Rationalism versus empiricism, heredity versus environment, instinct versus learning, nature versus nurture, human universals versus cultural relativism, human nature versus human culture, innate behavior versus acquired behavior, Chomsky versus Piaget, biological determinism versus social determinism, essentialism versus social construction, modularity versus domain generality, and so on.
All learning concerning man, ranging from history to linguistics and psychology, are faced with the question whether in the last instance we are the product of all kinds of external factors, or if in spite of our differences we have something we could call a common human nature by which we can call each other human beings.
But I'm not going to try to take us down every torturous byway of logic and argumentation that all of these different nature versus nurture debates produced over the course of all of these decades. because what I'm really trying to do is illustrate the impact that these arguments had on social movements. I'm going to focus on just one of these debates in particular, a totally paradigmatic one anyway, probably the most culturally noteworthy nature versus nurture debate that happened in the 20th century, Chomsky versus Foucault. But the reason that I'm selecting it is not just because it's famous and because I have audio of it, but also because I just think that in the course of that debate, you do in fact find everything that drives you crazy about politics today, somewhere or another, coming from Foucault. And the thing that I want to say about this is that I really don't think that we do pretentious intellectualism. Well, I don't think we do the aesthetics of pretentious intellectualism here and now anything like they did it in 1971 in France, because oh my God, if you watch the video, it's on YouTube. If you watch the video of this debate, it's like the most overstated aesthetics of intellectualism I think I've ever encountered. It's just this whole room full of people who are all just like the caricatures of the French, like the French theorists or whatever. They're all kind of like hunched over with their chins on their fists, peering over their spectacles with these, like, they're just like having this competition to see who can gaze with the most intense sort of like thoughtfulness or whatever. It's great. It's absolutely delightful. But so it starts with the moderator asking Chomsky what linguistics can tell us about human nature.
So my first question is to Mr. Chomsky, because you, Mr. Chomsky, employ often the concept of human nature, and even in this connection you are using terms like innate ideas and innate structures. Which arguments can you derive from linguistics in order to give such a central position to this notion of human nature?
And Chomsky gives a very reasonable answer. He talks about concrete observations that we can all make that require absolutely no specialization, and how, if we think about them for a second, we have to infer a pretty highly structured, pretty specifically contentful human nature. And I mean, I gotta say, Chomsky's big linguistic work from roughly this period, like kind of when he really established himself and his, started articulating his major contributions to linguistics, syntactic structures, is literally the single least comprehensible text I have ever fucking read. But I have to say, he's very capable of speaking in clear, definitive terms and just like making a point, where clearly the motivation for how he's talking isn't to dazzle people.
Well, let me begin in a slightly technical way. A person who's interested in studying language is faced with a very definite empirical problem.
And I have to mention, because it did just torment me so much when I was like 10 years old, that I was very tormented as a child by the empirical problem that Chomsky's talking about, which in my experience was, I used to read the dictionary a lot, and it wasn't really to expand my vocabulary, it was this search for origins, right, where I realized at some point looking in a dictionary that to understand the definition of any word, you really had to already have the definitions for a bunch of other terms in mind. And the more that I looked through the dictionary for kind of like the proto-terms that weren't self-referential, that didn't seem to already require a rich system of knowledge, the more I looked, the less I found it. The more that it seemed like to know language, to know anything about language, you would already have to know something about language.
Well, we're faced with a very clear and a reasonably clear and well-delineated scientific problem, namely the problem of accounting for the gap between the really quite small quantity of data, small and rather degenerate quantity of data that's presented to the person, to the child, and the very highly articulated, highly systematic, profoundly organized resulting knowledge that he somehow derives from this data.
So you see what I mean? Two versions of the same essential question. In my case, I'm looking at the structure of language and all the complexities of knowledge that it encompasses and implies, and I'm thinking there's no way that you could just learn this without having some preconceptions about what it was all going to say in the first place. And likewise, Chomsky is saying, look at the actual information that's presented to a young speaker of any given language. Look at how little explicit instruction, how unclearly the rules of that language are actually articulated, and how well people actually learn those rules. And I'm not really talking about this to illustrate how smart I was when I was 10 years old. I'm just trying to say that, look, he's talking about stuff that a 10-year-old can think about looking at a dictionary. He's talking about stuff that's very concrete. It's very observable.
That is, to put it rather loosely, the child must begin with the knowledge, certainly not with the knowledge that he's hearing English or Dutch or French or something else, but he does start with the knowledge that he's hearing a human language of a very narrow and explicit type that permits a very small range of variation. And it's because he begins with that highly organized and very restrictive schematism that he's able to make the huge leap from scattered and degenerate data to highly organized knowledge. And I would claim then that this instinctive knowledge, if you like, this schematism that makes it possible to derive complex and intricate knowledge on the basis of very partial data, is one fundamental constituent of human nature. But then I assume that in other domains of human intelligence and other domains of human cognition and even behavior, something of the same sort must be true. Well, the collection of this mass of innate schematisms, innate organizing principles, which guides our social and intellectual and individual behavior, that's what I mean to refer to by the concept of human nature.
And so that's Chomsky's big contribution. That's his central thesis that he's presenting in this debate, and that was his big contribution to linguistics in general, was this notion that we are born with a logical structure in our heads that all particular languages are individual manifestations of, or variations on. So then Foucault responds with what I think I would feel comfortable characterizing as nonsense and obfuscation.
Well, if you permit, I will answer in French, because my English is so bad that I would be ashamed to answer in English. Il est vrai que je me méfie un peu de cette notion.
It is true that I mistrust the notion of human nature a little, and for the following reason. I believe that of the concepts or notions which a science can use, not all have the same degree of elaboration, and that in general they have neither the same function nor the same type of possible use in scientific discourse. Let's take the example of biology. You will find concepts with a classifying function, concepts with a differentiating function, and concepts with an analytical function. Some of them enable us to characterize objects, for example that of tissue, others to isolate elements like that of hereditary features, others to fix relations such as that of reflex. There are at the same time elements which play a role in the discourse and in the internal rules of the reasoning practice. But there also exist peripheral notions, those by which scientific practice designates itself, differentiates itself in relation to other practices, delimits its domain of objects, and designates what it considers to be the totality of its future tasks. The notion of life played this role to some extent in biology during a certain period. So I guess what I would note at this point is just that what Foucault is talking about is simply not what Chomsky is talking about, in the sense that Chomsky refers to something pretty definitive and concrete, and Foucault is responding not by addressing what he talked about at all. There's never one point in this debate where Foucault is like, well, the thing about how people learn language, right? Well, the thing about the critical period where children acquire language very rapidly and during which, if you don't learn language, it's a much more thwarted, difficult process. You know, like that just never comes up. He never directly addresses anything Chomsky is saying, which all involve concrete observations right here in the corporeal world. He is instead talking about like the nature of knowledge itself, right? He's talking about whether, and essentially what he's doing is asking a question, just, you know, like with a whole lot of theory gibberish thrown in. He's just asking, like, how much can we really know, like, how perfect is our knowledge? Which is never an invalid question, but, you know. So he goes on. In the 17th and 18th centuries, the notion of life was hardly used in studying nature. One classified natural beings, whether living or non-living, in a vast hierarchical tableau which went from minerals to man. The break between the minerals and the plants or animals was relatively undecided. Epistemologically, it was only important to fix their positions once and for all in an indisputable way. At the end of the 18th century, the description and analysis of these natural beings showed, through the use of more highly perfected instruments and the latest techniques, an entire domain of objects, an entire field of relations and processes which have enabled us to define the specificity of biology and the knowledge of nature. Can one say that research into life has finally constituted itself in biological science? Has the concept of life been responsible for the organization of biological knowledge? I don't think so. It seems to me more likely that the transformations of biological knowledge at the end of the 18th century were demonstrated on one hand by a whole series of new concepts for use in scientific discourse, and on the other hand gave rise to a notion like that of life which has enabled us to designate, to delimit, and to situate a certain type of scientific discourse, among other things. I would say that the notion of life is not a scientific concept. It has been an epistemological indicator of which the classifying, delimiting, and other functions had an effect on scientific discussions, and not what they were talking about. Well, it seems to me that the notion of human nature is of the same type. So here's the essential claim, right? That essentially all he's saying is that our knowledge of human nature is imperfect and science is evolving. And then he goes through this really elaborate, this whole like elaborate taxonomy of different types of scientific knowledge. You know how there's like classifying functions and differentiating functions and analytical functions, and they characterize objects or they isolate elements or whatever. And I really don't know. As somebody who's been pretty fervent about biology for an awful long time, I don't really feel like I know what he's talking about, but it's certainly not the case that life is a concept that emerged entirely recently out of like, or is like a vague epistemological indicator or whatever in some like fairly recent, relatively speaking, development of a particular kind of science. Like life is definitely both a, you know, like a physical reality that we can characterize with a bunch of scientific approaches, and also something that people just have a pretty intuitive understanding of and have used as a concept in a wide array of cultures in different times and places fairly consistently. And it's actually like the concept of life is something that children develop pretty early on and pretty, like, fairly spontaneously without anybody really, like, sitting down and diligently instructing them in the nature of living versus non-living things. There's a bunch of research about this, and you know, like, the conclusions kind of vary. The evidence is a little bit mixed, but there does seem to be a fairly consistent, pretty robust notion of what a living thing is that children have at a pretty early age that's actually very coherent and internally consistent. And there's actually, and we can actually witness like a developmental, like different developmental phases of understanding the nature of life better and better. So like 4-year-olds will tend to use movement as a judgment for what's living and non-living way more than like 5-year-olds. There's a really big difference between like 3 to 5-year-olds in how much, to what extent they understand the distinction between a robot and a living thing. There's been research like that, where children view robot-human interactions and then like reason about the nature of the human versus the robot, and by the time kids are like 5, they have a much more advanced concept of, like, they have this sort of like unified sense of what a living thing is, that they kind of didn't when they were 3. So as with so many of our other cognitive aptitudes, you know, from language to recognizing faces to reasoning about the external world and understanding other people's states of minds and things like that, it seems like the concept of life comes on board during the stage of development, during the developmental process. And I'll throw some papers into the bibliography about that. Here's what one paper said about children's animacy assessments of humanoid robots. That differs by age. When judging the robot's life status, its mobility was important for 4-year-olds, and the psychological contingency for 5-year-olds. The psychological contingency is just the extent to which the robot behaves in any kind of socially appropriate manner. In terms of the robot's reasoning abilities, the majority of 4-year-old children clearly understood biological properties, regardless of the robot's features. But then certainly it is also true that the notion of life as like a scientific concept, or just like something that's like out there in like a general sort of cultural, like a category of cultural comprehension, is like it's a thing. It's not like life just came up recently because of some particular scientists. But yeah, Tooby and Cosmides talk about how for a long time science had a concept of life that was just kind of a distinct realm. Like rather than emerging gradually from like various discoveries, life was just this sort of categorical conception that people had, because there is just like an intrinsic psychological understanding of what it is. And so that the progress of science was often about unifying physical observations with the sort of abstract conceptual domain of life that we just have in our heads. They say, and one by one, the many gulfs separating life from non-life were bridged and then closed. Harvey and others found that the macrostructure of the body turned out to operate according to comprehensible mechanical principles. Wohler's synthesis of urea showed that the chemistries of the living and the non-living were not forever separated by the occult operation of special vitalistic forces. Right? That's the kind of, they go on, but that's the kind of, those were the notions that pertained to life for a long time. It was definitely like concretely understood as a phenomenon unto itself, and like comprised a very distinct category in people's minds. And it's simply, you know, like it was, as is so often the case with so many domains of knowledge, it was given kind of like its own, it was assumed that like a bunch of dynamics were at work in the operation of life that were unknowable and had like kind of no relationship to any other domain of knowledge or like process of physical observation. You know, so anyway, so that just all indicates that people have some kind of very definitive notion of life that they routinely employ, that it didn't come about in like a recent scientific development. But I guess all of this is rather specific, maybe borderline digressive, you know, because like the point ultimately is not whether or not people have a sort of robust conception of living versus non-living things. You know, like the question is ultimately whether Foucault's assertions are true or false. What he's saying either way is just that knowledge is imperfect. He says, well, it seems to me that the notion of human nature is of the same type. It was not studying human nature that linguists discovered the laws of consonant mutation, or Freud the principles of the analysis of dreams, or cultural anthropologists the structure of myths. In the history of knowledge, the notion of human nature seems to me mainly to have played the role of an epistemological indicator, to designate certain types of discourse in relation to or in opposition to theology or biology or history, I would find it difficult to see in this a scientific concept. And then he talks about how knowledge is accumulated. He says, it's as if applying a new grid which allows for the appearance of phenomena that have previously been masked, while at the same time masking already existing knowledge. Knowledge should not be thought of as a continuous and cumulative creation, but rather through a set of grids stacked on top of one another, which leak old and collect new knowledge. So, again, it's like a really complicated way of saying that human nature may exist, but it's not a robustly developed program of scientific research. But that's just that's really not a very good refutation of human nature to say it hasn't been studied as well as it should have been. And I just really don't know what to say about this kind of argumentation. It comprises whole vast literatures. In academia, there are just entire disciplines and subdisciplines of exquisitely refined language and dense texts that are all ultimately just variations on exactly this. They all are interdictions of perspectives that we're coming from and saying, well, are these perspectives kind of contingent? Is our knowledge imperfect? How much do we know about our knowledge? They're all just sort of epistemological arguments. And that's this is one of those things where it's never underestimate the power of the misapplication of a totally valid principle. Because this is never not true, right? Your knowledge is always imperfect. You are always approaching any situation with a bunch of contingent perspectives that are shaping your perception in ways that are ultimately really imperfect, right? And that is what it is like to be alive in the world, and to be an embodied being with a finite rational processing capacity, et cetera, et cetera. And so this is never you're never wrong to say this. You're never wrong to interdict somebody's assertion of a truth, to say well, look, I've observed this thing in the world, and I'm coming to this conclusion about it. You're never, ever, ever fundamentally in error to say, well, can you be totally certain of your perceptions? Is there some aspect of the situation that you're not seeing, or that you're seeing in a particular way because of some contingent perspective that you have? And it's yeah, sure. But at a certain point, the fundamental point is that at a certain point you have to synthesize the knowledge that's actually available to you. You have to work with the epistemology that's actually in your possession and draw conclusions and take actions in the world. There's no way to live a life it's always possible. When I wake up in the morning and I think I should make a cup of coffee, there's a certain amount of inference going on. There's not 100% certainty in my mind that, there's really still a downstairs, or that coffee ever existed, or that I didn't die 10 years ago, and this isn't all just a moment in my head that's playing out as I get run over by a bus. There's no way of knowing. There's no way to know that Descartes' demon isn't tricking my senses, I don't know. But at a certain point, I have to draw conclusions from the information that's available to my senses, construct a theory about what the world is and what my relationship to it is, and engage with it. So the next part of the debate kind of really does descend into chaos. They end up talking about this theme of creativity, but they're talking about two very radically different things. And so, I don't know, Foucault is talking about whether creativity plays a fundamental role in science, and he's saying that individual creativity is vastly overestimated, et cetera, et cetera. He throws around some more Foucault-esque language. He says of knowledge that it won't be compromised by history. It is necessary not that the truth constitutes itself in history, but only that it reveals itself in it. hidden to men's eyes, provisionally inaccessible, sitting in the shadows. It will wait to be unveiled. The history of truth would be essentially its delay, its fall, or the disappearance of the obstacles which have impeded it until now from coming to light. The historical dimension of knowledge is always negative in relation to the truth. And then Chomsky says, yeah, that's not what I'm talking about.
Les unes sur les autres cachées.
I think in part we're slightly talking in cross purposes because of a different use of the term creativity. In fact, I should say that my use of the term creativity is a little bit idiosyncratic, and therefore the onus falls on me, not on you in this case. But when I speak of creativity, I'm not attributing to the concept the notion of value that is normal when we speak of creativity. That is, when you speak of scientific creativity, you're speaking properly of the achievements of a Newton. But in the context in which I've been speaking about creativity, it's a normal human event. I'm speaking of the kind of creativity that any child demonstrates when he is able to come to grips with a new situation, describe it properly, react to it properly, tell us something about it, think about it in a new fashion for him, and so on. These are, I think it's appropriate to call those creative acts.
So there's that very fundamental misunderstanding. And Chomsky's talking about creativity that, like, literally all humans possess, and Foucault is responding, talking about the notion of creativity as it's applied to, like, individual creative geniuses within science or whatever. And then comes the point where they really start to seem like they're agreeing for a minute. And this is really interesting, even to the point of, like, the moderator seems confused about what both of them are saying. And so there's this moment where Foucault kind of corrects the moderator and is in agreement with the moderators talking about how human knowledge, human behavior would come about through, he's interpreting Chomsky as saying, through a combination of constraints and freedom. And Foucault says, no, what Chomsky is saying, and what I believe also, is that, you know, human behavior and knowledge comes about, the freedom only exists because of a set of constraints. He says freedom can only be truly exercised thanks to a system of regularity. So there's this moment, you know, because that's like the both, like, the fundamental point that they both converge on is that there is, like, an unarticulated system of constraints in place on human knowledge and human behavior. But then he says, you know, where perhaps I don't completely agree with Mr. Chomsky is where he places these regularities within the sphere of the human mind or human nature. Naturally, I would like to know whether one cannot discover the system of regularity and of constraint, which makes science possible somewhere else, even outside of the human mind, in social forms, in relations of production, in class struggles, etc. And, you know, and this is where it does become legitimately kind of frustrating that he simply doesn't respond to the, like, empirical foundations for what Chomsky is saying at all, right? So it's like we've just kind of gone through, Chomsky says, here's the empirical realities, here's why I don't think you can derive any conclusion other than that there is human nature from these empirical realities. And then Foucault is like, well, epistemological indicators, fixed relations between objects, blah, blah, blah. And then, you know, and then like a few minutes later, they're acknowledging that there's apparently some very significant set of, like, underlying unarticulated constraints operating in the human mind. And you know, Chomsky has said, like, this is true across cultures. This is like a concretely observable phenomenon. It doesn't matter what grid is stacked on what grid, leaking out what knowledge, or like anything like that, right? And Foucault is simply not responding. He's simply saying, well, you know, like, maybe we could seek this system of constraints in the human mind somewhere else, even though you've already said really specifically why the human mind is the only plausible source for them. You've already said that, like that people exhibit this regularity everywhere, and that it's like an intrinsic human developmental phenomenon, etc. So that's kind of really where the debate about whether there is or is not human nature, it's like essentially as far as it actually goes. And then we kind of just start getting into applications and stuff like that. And the next moment in the debate is by far the funniest, when the moderator says to Foucault, "But what does this theory of knowledge mean for your theme of the death of man or the end of the period of 19th, 20th centuries?" And Foucault says, "But this doesn't have anything to do with what we're talking about." And there's just this very awkward moment of like intellectual fail that, like this kind of, there's this sort of like pregnant silence for a second. It's pretty beautiful. So then they talk about science.
How is it that given a small amount of data, it's possible for various scientists, for various geniuses even over a long period of time, to arrive at some kind of a theory, at least in some cases, that is more or less profound and more or less empirically adequate? This is a remarkable fact. And in fact, if it were not the case that these scientists, including the geniuses, if they didn't have built into their minds somehow, obviously unconscious, specification of what is a possible scientific theory, then this inductive leap would certainly be quite impossible. Just as if each child did not have built into his mind the concept of human language in a very natural way, in a very narrowing way, then the inductive leap from data to knowledge of a language would be impossible. So even though the process of, let's say, deriving knowledge of physics from data is far more complex, far more difficult for us, for organisms such as us, far more drawn out in time, requires intervention of genius and so on and so forth, nevertheless, in a certain sense, the achievement of discovering physical science, or biology or whatever you like, is based on something rather similar to the achievement of the normal child in discovering the structure of his language.
And then they start talking about the potential for human society. They start talking about what their respective theories mean for future socio-political trajectories.
Well, let me begin by referring to something that I've already discussed. That is, if it is correct, as I believe it is, that a fundamental element of human nature is the need for creative work, for creative inquiry, for free creation without the arbitrary limiting effects of coercive institutions, then, of course, it will follow that a decent society should maximize the possibilities for this fundamental human characteristic to be realized. That means trying to overcome the elements of repression and oppression and destruction and coercion that exist in any existing society, ours, for example, as a historical residue. Now, a federated, decentralized system of free associations incorporating economic as well as social institutions would be what I refer to as anarcho-syndicalism, and it seems to me that it is the appropriate form of social organization for an advanced technological society in which human beings do not have to be forced into the position of tools, of cogs in a machine.
And then Foucault says, and, I guess I should really mention that the interplay of emotions and internal processes and whatnot that seem to be apparent in this debate are actually really interesting and quite often pretty hilarious when you watch the video. There's like a definite tension at times. There's a pretty conspicuous awkwardness at moments. And then, there's a lot of Foucault in particular, there's a lot of just physical attempts to really emanate a sort of intellectualism, a lot of pretty self-conscious actual posturing in a literal sense, to look as intellectual as possible. And then there's definitely moments where there's kind of like an overt aggressiveness. There's times, in particular, when like Foucault's body language is just like overtly aggressive, where Chomsky's saying something and Foucault has this kind of like gangster contempt thing going on that's pretty priceless. But yeah, I would say like this moment is when Foucault arguably becomes just kind of the most overtly like bitchy, you know, and he says, he's just kind of like mocking the notion that Chomsky can say anything about a potential future form of society. He says, I admit to not being able to define, not even to propose, an ideal social model for the functioning of our scientific or technological society. So not really like saying anything specific about Chomsky's vision, but more just saying that the very notion, the baseline premise of having a vision for a potential future form of society is in error. So then Foucault says that maybe instead of describing a general framework for the society that we're trying to create, we should instead critique institutions like universities and psychiatry. He says, but I believe that political power also exercises itself through the mediation of a certain number of institutions which look as if they have nothing in common with the political power and as if they are independent of it, while they are not. One knows this in relation to the family, and one knows that the university and in a general way all teaching systems, which appear simply to disseminate knowledge, are made to maintain a certain social class and power, and to exclude the instruments of power of another social class. Institutions of knowledge, of foresight and care, such as medicine, also help to support the political power. It's also obvious, even to the point of scandal, in certain cases related to psychiatry. It seems to me that the real political task in a society such as ours is to criticize the workings of institutions, which appear to be both neutral and independent, to criticize and attack them in such a manner that the political violence which has always exercised itself obscurely through them will be unmasked, so that one can fight against them. So that's a really important point. It's a fundamental distinction that I think is still playing out in movements and the approaches that people are taking to political work today. You know, like on the one hand, we have this Chomsky-esque approach, which is about describing a trajectory towards like a concrete form of society that you want to create. And then on the other hand, it's this project of critiquing institutions and assuming that critiques of like perceptual modes and systems of thinking will somehow result in the desired social transformation, right? Like just like radically different notions of what pursuing social change kind of fundamentally is. And so Chomsky replies that that's really too bad.
Still, I think it would be a great shame to lose or to put aside entirely the somewhat more abstract and philosophical, if you like, task of trying to draw the connections between a concept of human nature that gives full scope to freedom and dignity and creativity and other fundamental human characteristics and relates that to some notion of social structure in which those properties could be realized, in which meaningful human life could take place. And in fact, if we are thinking of social transformation or social revolution, though it would be absurd, of course, to try to draw out in detail the point that we're hoping to reach, still we should know something about where we think we're going.
So then Foucault says, and this is paradigmatic. This, I believe, more than any other moment in the debate, provides a very powerful justification of my claim that everything you want to know about why doing politics in 2020 is awful, you can learn from Chomsky v. Foucault in 1971. Foucault says,
and such a theory may tell it to us.
Oui, mais alors là, est-ce qu'il n'y a pas un danger?
Yes, but then isn't there a danger here? If you say that a certain human nature exists, that this human nature has not been given in actual society the rights and the possibilities which allow it to realize itself, that's really what you have said, I believe. And if one admits that, doesn't one risk defining this human nature, which is at the same time ideal and real, and has been hidden and repressed until now in terms borrowed from our society, from our civilization, from our culture. So there it is, folks. Maybe instead of doing something concrete, the most important political activity we could undertake is to critique the conceptual structures at work in various echelons of society, followed very rapidly by, well, we probably shouldn't undertake any concrete political endeavor because we might in the process replicate unconscious, unarticulated aspects of the conceptual systems or the oppressions or the cultural frameworks or the contingent perspectives of the society that we're trying to reshape, right? So there's every meeting ever right there. And I have to say, so this is when I started this series, I was like, well, I'm going to talk about how social sciences in the 20th century shaped political movements, and I had not actually watched or listened to or read the transcript of the Chomsky versus Foucault debate. So I decided to check it out for potential material, and then I thought that just in terms of its actual content, it was perfect, but I do have to say there's this one moment in particular where I was like, oh, there's the profound validation of my premise, where when Foucault says this thing about carrying the baggage of our society into our assessment of what human nature is, where Chomsky has this look on his face, and it's the look. And I don't know what proportion of my audience goes to or has a history of having gone to political meetings, but if you have, there's that look when this comes up, right? That very distinct. There is this very particular facial expression of exhaustion that people get when it's you've been having the conversation and you're like, okay, well, let's maybe we could propose a 20% reduction in fossil fuel emissions, maybe we could propose rezoning or whatever. You're talking about something concrete. And then that moment happens where somebody's like, well, maybe we can't do anything. Maybe we should just inhabit a wilderness of gibberish concerning what our contingent frames of reference are, and we shouldn't take any concrete action at all. And there's that moment of just straight exhaustion. You can just see no matter how, and it's typically the case that people are very polite and take great measures to appear congenial, but you can just see the pain and the exhaustion in people's faces. Chomsky totally has that look at that moment in the debate. And then the other thing that I'll say about this is I'll relate it back to what I said about the very first stuff that Foucault says in this debate, which is just that however sophisticated or simply it's phrased, ultimately all that's happening is that he's just saying how perfect is our knowledge. What do we ultimately know? And this is one of these things where it's I really feel it seems sophisticated to people solely because of the language that's employed. It's really just the 7 subclauses per sentence kind of thing. It's really just the phrasing. And if you talk about this, if you get out of the realm of 17th century science, epistemological indicators, if you employ these same basic sort of approaches, if somebody's like, hey, did you do the dishes? And you're like, well, but really, when you really think about it, what are the dishes really? And what does it mean to say that the dishes are done as opposed to not done? Isn't that a really Cartesian dualism kind of thing? You can do this with anything, right? You can always be yeah, but what do we really know? What is reality ultimately anyway, And if you do it with as much hyper academic theory gibberish as Foucault, people are going to think that you're talking about something. But if you're well, ultimately, what are the dishes and what does it mean to say they're clean? People are that's just childish. It's just childish. And I think that I relate all of this to the first time that I smoked weed when I was 13 years old. And I remember, I got high and it was terrifying. And then the next day at school, I went from feeling pretty normal to like pretty high again, and that was the moment, right, where I'm like sitting in the class. I think that we were talking about Dostoevsky, and I was like looking at all of my classmates, and I'm like, they don't perceive what I perceive. Who is the ultimate arbiter? Which one of us is right? I guess nobody's right. There's no unifying thread to our perceptions. And then I remember later that night thinking like, okay, right, like, you know, like I don't know if the world is really here. I don't know if I live in a simulation. I don't know if there's an evil demon generating my perceptions, whatever. But like what I ultimately know is that my perceptions do have parameters, that I wake up in the morning and there's a world there that has like these definite observable properties that were there when I fell asleep. And so I kind of just have to live in that world, right? And I very often feel like the entire realm of critical theory, like the entire academic departments and whole obscure trajectories of thought and in like wildernesses of theoretical language and all that are all ultimately the product of people smoking that weed and having that freak out and then just never really coming to the reconciliation where they're like, okay, but I am experiencing something that at a certain point I have to formulate a response to. I have to acknowledge that my knowledge is imperfect, and then I have to operate on the basis of that knowledge anyway because that's what I got. And, you know, like it's one of those things, a few times in this show at this point, I've talked about a frame of reference as specifically like a thing that excludes some types of information and emphasizes, like seeks out and finds other types of information. And I think that, you know, like this is one of those cases where they're just operating in different frames of reference, because you can always say like, my knowledge is imperfect. Look at all these ways in which my perspective is contingent, and I don't truly know, like I don't have an absolute understanding of the universe. Or you can always say like, well, look at all these observations I have. Like these are the conclusions I'm coming about to them. They must be true. I feel completely certain of everything I know. Or you can synthesize the two, and you can say, well, my knowledge is always going to be imperfect, but I'm going to act on the knowledge that I have. And I feel like Foucault is simply inhabiting, he's exclusively inhabiting the frame of our knowledge is imperfect. And he's just living there and never getting to the point where he's saying like, well, okay, with our imperfect knowledge, I am going to draw these conclusions. You know, and essentially Chomsky responds with something to that effect. He says that he talks about his work opposing the Vietnam War and like civil disobedience, and he says that, you know, one potential consequence of civil disobedience is that society will actually just become more fascistic, you know. So like he's like, there is ultimately a very serious possibility that our undertaking will have harmful consequences. But the consequence of doing nothing is Southeast Asia being annihilated by the United States. So I've weighed the competing harms, and I've decided that I'm going to try to intervene in the Vietnam War, right? You know, like, and he says, likewise, describing human nature, pursuing long-term trajectories of sociopolitical transformation, having like a notion of a future form of society. These are instances likewise where we really can't know how imperfect our knowledge is, or what, you know, like what unintended consequences what we do might have. But at a certain point, we, you know, there's no such thing as not acting. There's no way to not respond. It's just a question of how we respond to the situations that we're in. And so at a certain point, you know, you synthesize the imperfect knowledge you have and you respond on the basis of it. And then the rest of the debate is Chomsky talking about taking action against injustice, and Foucault essentially saying, oh, but what is injustice, naturally, right? And, you know, isn't your conception of justice, naturally, going to be contingent and contaminated from the society that you're trying to change, etc.? And Chomsky saying, yeah, but I mean, what other basis do I have to try to intervene in politics or whatever? And Foucault saying, Foucault saying essentially, I just don't believe in justice. The proletariat makes war with the ruling class because, for the first time in history, it wants to take power. One makes war to win, not because it is just. I don't think that as far as the aim which the proletariat proposes for itself in leading a class struggle is concerned, it would be sufficient to say that it is in itself a greater justice. What the proletariat will achieve by expelling the class which is at present in power, and by taking over power itself, is precisely the suppression of the power of class in general. And then Chomsky's like, well, okay, that's a claim of making a more just world. Otherwise, why would you do it? Like, if you just want the proletariat to take power and it creates, nothing but endless coercion and violence and chaos, like, in what sense would it be good? And there's just kind of this, like, basic disparity between this, between these two people in terms of, like, whether they can conceive of a system of, like, better or worse human relations at all, or like, whether we should just kind of go for some dictatorship of the proletariat, and however terrible or good it is, at least it'll be different, I guess. I don't know. So that's the official Fight Like an Animal, Chomsky versus Foucault, blow by blow. And I think that there's three major themes that I want to note in terms of how the type of reasoning on display in this debate has totally shaped our experience of political intervention now. The first is the primacy of linguistic and conceptual systems over physical reality. The sense that those shape human experiences and behavior and social systems, and that we should look at language and conceptualization over material conditions, like what's actually happening in physical reality between people. Here's what David Graeber said in Fragments of an Anarchist Anthropology, actually specifically about Foucault, although he's talking about a broader tendency that I thought was pretty amazing. Academics love Michel Foucault's argument that identifies knowledge and power. It insists that brute force is no longer a major factor in social control. They love it because it flatters them. The perfect formula for people who like to think of themselves as political radicals, even though all they do is write essays likely to be read by a few dozen other people in an institutional environment. Of course, if any of these academics were to walk into their university library to consult some volume of Foucault without having remembered to bring a valid ID and decided to enter the stacks anyway, they would soon discover that brute force is really not so far away as they like to imagine. A man with a big stick, trained in exactly how hard to hit people with it, would rapidly appear to eject them. But yeah, that's definitely like a major aspect of Foucault's theoretical contribution, the notion that systems of power are moving away from physical punishments and physical coercion towards like an elaborate web of other forms of social control and institutions like universities and psychiatry, et cetera, media discourse, blah, blah, blah. And while it might certainly be true that a bunch of other institutions like that have proliferated to extend and elaborate social control, it is pretty emphatically, at this point, I would say that Foucault's theory has been pretty powerfully, empirically invalidated by the subsequent 50 years of human history in which border walls and incarceration and prisons and policing and all that have not exactly disappeared, and in which we're having essentially the same conversations about the same kind of social forms and like the same kind of like authoritarian structures emerging that we were having in like 1945. And I would just note that the tendency to emphasize language and conceptual systems exclusively and to kind of like oppose those to physical reality is in and of itself a manifestation of a broader tendency to just inhabit false binaries in general, right? To do that really requires seeing linguistic and conceptual systems as like a truly distinct realm that exists in a totally false opposition to, like physicality or whatever. Like Tooby and Cosmides say, Thus, humans, like every other natural system, are embedded in the contingencies of a larger principled history, and explaining any particular fact about them requires the joint analysis of all the principles and contingencies involved. To break this seamless matrix of causation, to attempt to dismember the individual into biological versus non-biological aspects, is to embrace and perpetuate an ancient dualism endemic to the Western cultural tradition: material-spiritual, body-mind, physical-mental, natural-human, animal-human, biological-social, biological-cultural. This dualistic view expresses only a pre-modern version of biology whose intellectual warrant has vanished. Yeah, and I do think that's really important, because ultimately, like Foucault's whole gimmick is to talk about epistemology and to try to interdict knowledge by saying, like, well, look at all of the imperfections in the system of analysis that produce this knowledge, and one of the classic recourses that people in that tradition have is to call things reductionist, or to call things Cartesian or dualistic or whatever. But really, the approach of saying, well, there's biology and there's culture, there's human nature, and then there's social systems, is the most incoherently schismatic, the most meaninglessly reductionist, ultra-binary thinking that one can ever hope to engage in. And this is why people who are advocating for a biologically grounded approach to understanding behavior always seem to end up talking about integration or unification of knowledge or something like that, and people who are pushing social constructivism always talk about schisms or ruptures or incommensurate domains. So Tooby and Cosmides call their model the integrated causal model. Konrad Lorenz, who wrote extensively about animal behavior in relation to humans, called his approach monism. There's this one body of knowledge. E.O. Wilson wrote a book called Consilience on the Unity of All Knowledge about exactly this, about social sciences. So the second major theme that I would note is just the emphasis on uncertainty, the emphasis on the perpetual assessment of our perspectives and the imperfections in our knowledge that I've already noted, and the sense in which that conversation that Foucault and Chomsky are having is just exactly the same conversation that everybody is still having in politics today. And then 3, I would note the theme of the existence of an infinite wilderness of distinct epistemologies, how Chomsky is talking about phenomena that can be observed in all people, that are reliable indicators of humanness everywhere that humans are found. In Foucault, over and over again, is saying, yeah, but think about all the grids that are stacked on all the other grids, and think about how people in different cultures coming from different systems of thought have totally irreconcilable views of the world. And this is always true, right? It is always true that people are coming from different, very contingent perspectives, and their knowledge is always imperfect. But still, like we've talked about in the last couple episodes, it can be very easy to radically overstate how different people actually are. And this has been the central approach of this kind of social science, especially within the discipline of anthropology. Within other sort of forms of theory, the more Foucault tradition, it's just about looking at different perspectives, different social roles that people have and different perspectives, and how they're supposedly more radically different than they are. And then within anthropology, it's about finding some exotic people and claiming that they're more different from everybody else than they actually are. And people often have a head full of I've noticed that lay people tend to have a head full of examples that they picked up somewhere or other about this, well, in culture X there's no such thing as Y, One of the ones that a lot of people do seem to have in their head is the like Hopi time thing, or more broadly the notion that language, once again, completely shapes our perceptions. So to quote a little bit from Human Universals, this is on the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. Whorf is the person most frequently associated with an extreme version of this argument, in which our language or its categories shape our thoughts and worldview. What our language does not classify, we don't see, don't readily see, or don't attend to. Whorf stated his position in both extreme and more reasonable forms. It is the former that are of interest here. Whorf studied the Hopi language and by 1936 had come to a startling conclusion. One of the fundamental categories of Western thought, time, is culturally relative. To quote from Whorf, after long and careful study and analysis, the Hopi language is seen to contain no words, grammatical forms, constructions, or expressions that refer directly to what we call time, or to past or future, or to enduring or lasting. Whorf did not hesitate to draw the relativist conclusion. I find it gratuitous to assume that a Hopi who knows only the Hopi language and the cultural ideas of his own society has the same notions, often supposed to be intuitions, of time and space that we have, and that are generally assumed to be universal. In particular, he has no general notion or intuition of time as a smooth-flowing continuum in which everything in the universe proceeds at an equal rate, out of a future, through a present, into a past. And so this turned out to be like purely a literary experiment, the ways ultimately that Whorf was claiming that Hopis had no conception of time were by just like finding ways to say that their culture like conceptualized time differently. I mean, it gets really, there's just not a lot there. Beginning in the 1970s, Ekahart Molotky undertook a study of Hopi time and space. The opening page of the resulting book on time quotes a Hopi sentence, translates it literally, and then rephrases the translation as follows. Then indeed, the following day, quite early in the morning at the hour when people pray to the sun, around that time, then he woke up the girl again. This sentence alone, assuming it did not include terms and ideas only recently borrowed by Hopi, would seem to be enough to dispose of any contention about the absence of time concepts among the Hopi. But Molotky goes on with more than 600 pages of documentation of Hopi temporal metaphors, units of time, including days, day counts, segments of the day, yesterday and tomorrow, days of the week, weeks, months, lunations, seasons in the year, the ceremonial calendar, timekeeping devices, pluralization and quantification of time expressions, such miscellaneous time words as ancient, quick, long time, finished, and so on, the Hopi tense system, and even more. So now we see the first major theme and the second in conjunction here, like the primacy of language and conceptual systems, and then the tendency to, that those are a distinct universe that have to be analyzed without reference to any physical system or any other domain of knowledge. And they, like the notion that they're completely shaping our experience, and then that provides a framework for overstating the extent to which people are different. Supposedly Hopis have no sense of time because you analyze the way they use their language in some like really spectacularly literary way, such that you can claim that it's really different, but, it's just like, it just isn't. Roger Edgerton, in his book Six Societies, which I quoted a lot in the last episode, says about this, not all scholars who oppose positivism are as nihilistic as Tyler, nor as beguiled by postmodern discourse, but most would probably agree that the postmodern relativists, if we may call them that, are asserting far more than the self-evident point that people in different societies live in somewhat different worlds of meaning. They are claiming that each of these worlds is truly unique, incommensurable, and largely incomprehensible, and that the people who inhabit them have different cognitive abilities. In what Dan Sperber has referred to as cognitive apartheid, and Ernest Gellner has called cognitive anarchy, Various postmodern relativists and interpretivists postulate fundamental differences from one culture to the next in cognitive processes involving logic, causal inference, and information processing. The existence of such basic cognitive differences has yet to be demonstrated, and if the history of research into human cognition and intersubjectivity is any guide, it will not be. And so, talk about unanticipated consequences. This approach in anthropology of overstating the differences between people based on culture started out with the intention of demonstrating that there's a fundamental, like the anthropological phrase was the psychic unity of mankind, that there weren't really big differences between people in terms of populations. And that very quickly became, as a matter of logical necessity, showing that culture shapes everything and there isn't any human nature, something that we can comfortably describe as cognitive apartheid, claiming people that there is in fact absolutely no psychic unity whatsoever, and that people live in entirely incommensurate and incomprehensible epistemological universes. So those are the major themes that I wanted to note. It's 1971, and there's this approach to viewing the world out there that emphasizes language and conceptual systems at the expense of corporeal reality, that is incessantly preoccupied with interdicting one's own perspective and examining the imperfections in one's own knowledge rather than engaging in more concrete tasks, and is really all about radically overstating the differences between people. So, what could possibly go wrong, right? And that's what we'll talk about in the next episode, because in 1971, the system of thought that Foucault was exhibiting in his debate with Chomsky was like very representative of a whole massive tradition. I would say the majority position, even though it's hard to define a majority or a consensus because people were operating in really incommensurate terms, because that is a consequence of denying human nature. But the majoritarian position in social sciences really is some version of the kind of reasoning that Foucault is invoking in this debate. But it certainly was not the case that this type of perceptual system was really all that evident in social movements at all. And so in the next episode, we will trace the development. We'll trace a few interrelated developments, taking us from kind of like the end-ish of the 20th century to the present day. So it's like the development of the internet, the end of history, the resurgence of social forms and conflicts that everybody had been trying to convince themselves had already been resolved at some other point in human history, like authoritarianism and things like that. And the shift in science, the increasing departure, the increasing degree of distance between this way of looking at the world that Foucault embodies in this debate and in social sciences at large, which increasingly began, I don't know, in the 90s or so. Sometime around, Tooby and Cosmides wrote the essay that I quoted extensively in this episode in 1992, and like that, I would say somewhere in there, early 90s, more and more social sciences just started incorporating innateness in this kind of great debate. It stopped being the case that every time people talked about an innate aspect of human behavior, there had to be a big theoretical debate about whether there was human nature or whether innateness was an appropriate way to examine behavior, and people just started producing results. There was just too much compelling evidence out there and too much interesting science to do. So there's a increasing distance between social sciences and this kind of thinking, but then there's also a corresponding intensification of this kind of thinking. Like, it becomes more radical and overstated the more it gets abandoned by everybody else. And so we will follow that trajectory. We'll follow like the development of the internet and how its development interacted in a really interesting way with the like the notion that we live in a wilderness of totally distinct, incommensurate epistemologies or perceptual systems or whatever. And, we will talk about the entire grand adventure that we are currently on. So until that time, friends, keep loving, keep fighting. Thank you so much for listening, and I will talk to you soon.
Il est vrai que je me méfie un peu de cette notion de nature humaine. Il est vrai que je me méfie un peu de cette notion de nature humaine. Mais je m'en méfie pour la raison. Parmi les concepts. Il est vrai que je me méfie un peu de cette notion de nature humaine. Bien évidemment, je m'en méfie pour la raison suivante. Je crois que parmi les concepts, parmi les notions dont une science peut se servir, il y a évidemment des notions qui sont d'un niveau, qui sont une élaboration, qui ont une fonction différente. Donc, prenons le cas de la biologie, à l'intérieur, dans le domaine de la biologie, vous avez des concepts qui sont plus ou moins bien